Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Atlantic Bushcraft Adventures. Tonight we are on episode 212, and back with us again this week we have Matthew. And we had Matthew on with us, I think it was 3 weeks ago. We were just talking there. Matthew has a wilderness school, does some online courses, is going to be moving here shortly and hopefully setting up a second location for his school. But for this week, we have asked him back because a topic he had mentioned 3 weeks ago that we said we are going to expand on a little bit is kind of the history on survival and primitive skills in general. And you started talking a little bit about it then, Matthew, and I kind of had to shut you down because it was a great episode. So we drug you back, and hopefully we're going to hit that hard this week.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun to join and talk about survival, which I love. And I've, pretty much have been doing nothing but thinking about survival and plants for 10 years now. So always good to be able to have people to talk to who actually care to listen. So thanks for having me.
No, thank you for coming back. We always love sharing this information out. And we'd mentioned just before we started the show there, we actually had quite a few people say they were looking forward to this episode. So hopefully we meet their expectations.
Yeah. Yeah, so should you want me to just jump in sort of where we left off last time?
Well, I was going to say, how do you want to lay this out? Because I assume you prepared how you wanted to lay this out. Why don't you walk us through it?
Sure. Yeah, so last episode, I had talked about sort of the three eras of survival knowledge. When you hear people use the term wilderness survival, there's really about four different things they could mean. And so I put it into four different categories. The first would be the sort of preppers or the urban survival crowd, who are people who are more, located in urban areas, who are sort of prepping for disaster, so to speak. So that category is almost a completely different category than the other three. So there's that category of the preppers, which is its own distinct skill set, and definitely came about more recently. Probably, I would say the prepping movement started in the Cold War era, because you had the mindset of, nuclear war could pop off at any moment. But then the other three categories that I, usually teach about and talk about are the primitive living skills category, the bushcraft or sort of pioneer skills, and then the point I was trying to make was that the past 100 years, we have really a whole new field of survival that's distinctly different from those other two. So I think really it's important to differentiate wilderness living with survival, because the two terms are oftentimes used interchangeably. But wilderness living skills is a lot more sort of what you guys cover on with bushcraft, is just a very general sort of living in the wilderness. That could be long-term, that could be just basic camping skills. And I think survival specifically needs to be defined as a more narrow range within those skills. So under the umbrella of wilderness living, but a more very specific category where we're really concerned with short-term emergency survival situations and techniques for for surviving those first 3 days out in the bush and not much else. So that's how a lot of the experts sort of define it. And then, the primitive living skills is really its own little subset as well. And we sort of talked about that. So I have a book here sort of about the primitive living, which is, it's called Primitive Technology, a Book of Earth Skills. And it's edited by David Westcott, who's sort of one of the big names in that sort of field. But the primitive stuff is really cool. And it really, that sort of subset of survival traces back to the Native American roots. A lot of what we know about the primitive living skills is, well, let me put it this way. The Native Americans, that's where we get a lot of our edible plant knowledge, is from native tribes, right? Because a lot of the plants that were used in Europe, they may not grow in, North America. So a lot of the plant knowledge we have in the survival world, most of it comes from Native American ethnobotany, right? So we sort of talked about that. We talked about the bushcraft era. But then the point that I was trying to make near the end of the episode was that survival as we know it now is distinctly different than bushcraft, wilderness living, the Native American skills of the past and sort of the early European pioneer skills, what we have now is actually a distinctly different type of wilderness survival, which has only come around over the past century and is directly related to warfare. So the point I make is that a lot of what we know about survival, the information never would have came about if it wasn't for warfare. Funding in a large part the research that was necessary to bring the survival skills sort of world into the modern era. So because of warfare, we have a lot of knowledge from studies that would have never been done, and of course, just in the scientific age in general, a lot of what we thought we knew about survival sort of changed, and we have a lot more information. Now we have the internet, so we can take all these different survival stories from all around the world and sort of analyze them and have a central, point for survival information sort of to flow to. Yeah.
So, would you say that the changes in the last years might have also led to like the? I know the technology has advanced with the times, but in the last few years myself, I've noticed there's been a big drive on a lot of the prepping and survival stuff, which is directly related to the bushcrafting and stuff, as you were talking there. But a lot of the technology on that has advanced a lot more in the last, let's say, 20 years than it had in the prior time span to that. So would you say that's attributed to what you were talking about there, or is that more just a technology catching up to the industry kind of deal, or the industry catching up to the technology?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, technology's changed almost everything as we know it in the past 20 years with, the internet becoming commonplace in everyday households and stuff. But what I'm really referring to is starting, in the 1900s with World War One. I'll give you an example, like frostbite and trench foot was common, right? You have all these medical issues, and whenever you have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people dealing with the same medical issue, you start to learn very quickly where maybe a physician would not have been able to learn in a whole lifetime what a physician on the battlefield could learn in 2 years, because they're getting now thousands of people with trench foot. So then you start to learn how to treat trench foot, and you get really good at treating trench foot, and you start developing new protocols for treating trench foot and for treating frostbite and things like that. And then really with the scientific studies that were done. So I have a couple examples I gave last time. We can actually go through them a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what kind of scientific studies you're talking about here, because I mean, not to simplify it a lot of people that potentially listen to this podcast or just getting new into this, they figure, it's just surviving in the woods. And I know Ben and I have always joked, like, if you're having fun, you're not surviving. That's kind of how we always define it, because we have done an episode on like what's the difference between survival and bushcraft, and Ben and I joked about this a lot, that if you're having fun, you're probably not surviving. Survival is a situation that you get into usually unknowingly. As we're bushcrafting what we do, we know what we're going in to do, and we try to discern between survival and bushcraft that way for our aspect. But what kind of scientific evidence led to the progression of bushcrafting, if that makes
great question.
Sense?
Yeah, what does science have to do with surviving in the wilderness, right? Well, as you start to learn more about survival and spend more time in the woods, you'll quickly find that the elements are actually the number one enemy that you're really fighting against. And so a great example of how science has advanced the field of survival is in this study that was done in the 1940s, which led to this book called Physiology of Man in the Desert. And so during the early parts of World War II, the University of Rochester and the United States Army worked together to run a series of tests on men out in the desert. And they wanted to answer questions about human physiology so that they could manage troops on the battlefield in desert regions. So they asked questions like, how much water does a person need? How long can a person go, without water? How long could someone walk without water? How many gallons of water do troops need in a day doing various levels of work at different temperatures. And how do you survive in the desert without water? What are the techniques and strategies and things like that? So now you have this whole medical book, but it's actually, all of these studies are meant to have a practical application in the field. And so you see this happening, which of course is a study funded by ultimately warfare, right? You're not going to be having the money to be able to spend and having all these people out in the desert studying them, putting them on scales, taking all these measurements and stuff without money. So warfare, led to that. And we get a lot of the best desert survival information. I would, read this book and you'll become a desert survival expert, because most people are not going to read this book. But you can actually get it for free online. And then another great example is of the field of survival being furthered due to warfare and studies. This one wasn't really a study, but it's a book called Arctic Manual. And it was also, they hired an Arctic explorer by the name of Vilhelmir Stephenson. And he was an Arctic explorer in the 1920s up in Canada, Alaska. He actually crossed the Beaufort Sea on foot, because it, I don't know if it still freezes over like it used to, but back in the day, you could, cross the Beaufort Sea on foot in the wintertime. And he named some islands up in northern Canada. Well, the United States Army, prior to World War II, sort of in preparation for World War II, they could see that war was on the horizon. In about 1939, they hired him to create an Arctic manual. He ended up creating this massive tome. It's something like 600, or it's in the 400 or 500 pages. And then they hired someone from the Army to actually make it smaller into a field manual. So there's two versions. There's the FM 240 military manual, which is the shortened version, and then his manual. But this is a work that would have never been done had they not hired him. And of course, he scoured all of the libraries that he had available, at his disposal. So we have a wonderful, excellent work on Arctic survival that was bought and paid for by the military. So that's another
Just
example.
Just to confirm the name of that book, Matthew. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. That's Arctic Man, right?
Arctic Manual.
Sorry, it's Arctic Manual, Chris. We just had somebody ask from the comments there, just because the name's not written on the book. I assume they're making some jot notes there. So Arctic Manual.
Yeah, if you're taking notes, get your pen ready. I'll tell you how to spell his first name. It's Vilhjalmur. Vilhelmir. Yeah.
Okay.
And so,
while we're on the subject of military studies here, I don't know if Ben's ever told you there, but he had done some military in the background. So for me, as a civilian, I'm curious, Ben, do you still find that a lot of the stuff that Matthew's talking about here still happens when I know it's been a while, don't get me wrong, but I know they still give you a lot of stats like that, like how far you can go. You've said it before about exhaustion. Do they still take a lot of that into account?
Well, if you think about it, everything that a soldier does has been calculated out. How much his pack should weigh, what gear we put into the pack, what type of boots we wore, what type of jackets we were given. Everything was calculated to give us the best chance of survival if we got left. And the two recently, we've often referenced two books, are the SAS survival book, and there's a Canadian version called Down But Not Out. I have a version of it somewhere here. And it talks solely about how to survive from a military standpoint. And exactly like Matthew said, you've got, thousands of people in an area, and if they're getting sick, injured, ill, one ill person takes out 4 people in the military. You can't afford to have a sick person because it takes a couple of people to look after him or get him out of there. So there's a lot of resources on preventing that. And if they get separated, how to keep soldiers alive for longer, because the soldier's worth a hell of a lot more alive than dead. And so it's a huge effort.
Yeah, so more on the topic of sort of science. I know it's a great question. How could science help? A few more examples would be well, let's see. I have a book here. There's a couple interesting things in the Cold War. They call the 50s and 60s the golden age of frostbite research. because we actually learned so much about frostbite that the protocol of how to actually treat frostbite was changed, and the previous protocol before the 50s and 60s that had been in place had probably been in place for 1,000 years. I mean, people were treating frostbite by rubbing snow on the feet, which is a common treatment all throughout history. And by scientific studies, and also from after the Korean War, I think frostbite became got national attention. Right, the Korean War was a absolutely vicious war. The winter of the winter of 1951 to 1952, Battle of Chosin Reservoir. We have the Marines, getting a significant amount of deaths from the cold and frostbite. They call them the chosen few, the people who are, survived that and sort of were, to this day, the people who are still alive are, will sort of walk funny a lot of times because they've missing toes or had such bad frostbite injuries. And so, when we were thinking we're going to go to war with Russia, a lot of scientific studies were done into frostbite, and also just the science of hypothermia, and also the science of clothing. I think people don't realize the strides in engineering in the past 30, 40, 50 years of just the clothing we wear, the materials, developing new materials. We have books like The Biology of Human Survival, right? We have books on this book, Keeping Warm and Dry by Harry Roberts, is a great text that just really introduces you to some of the basics of clothing and some of the science of clothing a little bit. Excuse me. He was a outdoorsman, but he also owned an outdoor store where they sold high quality, like Columbia, the Patagonia, all of those. And a lot of people don't realize that when you're paying $200 for a jacket, you're not doing it for a brand name. You're doing it because engineers actually made those, all the science behind it is it took a long time to figure that type of stuff out. But absolutely, yeah, science is huge. We have books like The Psychology of Survival, right, which goes to sort of how people behave in disaster situations. This is a really good book for first responders or anyone that would be, in a real disaster type situation, learning the psychology. Another really good one is The Essentials of Sea Survival. Really a great text, even for people who are not planning on going to lakes or the ocean. It's still great for learning how to deal with cold, wet conditions. And the authors are, both are PhDs, and one of them's an MD. So they talk about the physiology and things like that. And a lot of these things originated during the Cold War because, we're really at a race with Russia to be the most technologically advanced, to understand the human body and how, that's what they were trying to create, right? With super soldiers, basically, who could fight Russians. And they were worried the Russians were doing the same thing. So there's just a lot of military spending after World War II to make sure that we were going to stay, up to date with Russia and be able to, fight effectively, right? So you have a lot of these studies coming, but of course, all of them are they're studying with a practical application in mind. So it's not just science, but it's how do we apply this in the field. And so today, I think the average person definitely wants to learn about hypothermia, heat stroke, how to treat frostbite, how to prevent frostbite, and even the science of staying warm, conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation, learning about the heat exchanges and the heat losses, learning about the physiology of dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. All of these things are, sort of boring to learn. It's not the first thing you think of when you think of survival training, but all of the experts, all of the greats were aware of this stuff. In the past 100 years, if you're a survival instructor, you had to know this type of stuff. And, it's not just weekend campouts, but it's also the nitty gritty work of getting into the literature and actually seeing, how people have died in the past and what you can do to avoid those situations.
So just a couple things from the comments here. just before they go too far. So, Chris Lovelace, I bought Camping and Survival by Paul to- Tarwell. I probably butchered that. Do you know the book by any chance?
Actually, no, not off the top of my head.
Okay, so for him, he was asking if he had an opinion. To him, it's his holy grail. He brings it bushcrafted with him just due to the massive amount of knowledge. So it might be something for yourself to take a look at. Another one that Ben had just sent me over here is called Lost Person Behavior, which I'm not familiar with it myself, but are you familiar with it, Ben?
It's taught in search and rescue in Canada, and it actually breaks down what people do when they get lost, down to even subsets like how old they are, what their health condition is, are they cycling, are they hiking, are they hunting, are they fishing, what's their background. It breaks people down in a lot of categories, but it's another area of a lot of study of how people tend to survive and how different backgrounds will affect it. It's more, I sent it to you more because it's another thing that was search and rescue is generally still funded by the military, because over our military's search and rescue is usually a subdivision of the military, and so they funded a lot of money because they spend a lot of resources finding people, and they don't like spending those resources. So how can we make that easier? So it's just another example of where the military funded, training on this stuff.
And one last comment there, just more to your point. Um, Chris Jones joins us. We did a lot of testing in the lab during graduate school, calculating survival based on food and water, temperature, environment, carry weight, and all sorts of quote unquote human limit calculations. He said it was actually quite a bit of fun.
Yeah. What was that first book you said?
The first book Chris Lovelace mentioned is called Camping and Survival by Paul, and the last name is Tawrell.
All right, thanks. I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm always looking for the best books.
And for anybody
Yeah.
listening, hopefully the three of us can coordinate at the end of this, and I'll try and make a master list of books we mentioned here, because some of our listening fans will not be watching this live, of course, and they may want to check back. So we'll talk about that after the fact.
Yeah. I actually have a 20. It's like 20 books. My top 20 favorite books on survival PDF. I can send over if you want. But
Oh wow.
yeah. And to the point of search and rescue, I think search and rescue are the types of people, the people who really do it. Those are the types of people you need to go to. It's not always the YouTube sort of survival. There's a lot of good people on YouTube, but I think you know what I mean when I say the YouTube survivalist, where it's more like nifty little tips and tricks, how to turn a soda pop can into a
angles.
yeah, there are a lot of different angles, and I don't mean to put people down who teach on YouTube, but I think we all have seen where it's like kind of wasting your time learning some of it. But the search and rescue, those are the types of professions that really understand the science a lot of times and will really get into it. And also people like mountaineers. Mountaineer books are some of the best because those are people who are really out there in the field all the time. Those are the people who learn about hypothermia. Those are people who are going into the most extreme environments. And so books on like cold weather and hypothermia and cold weather clothing, those are some of the things that, well, I think the approach to survival needs to be that you don't just buy a bunch of survival books, but that you buy books on the specific topics surrounding survival.
Yes.
Right.
No, perfect point there. And if you've seen Ben and I snickering, it's not at you, Matthew. Steve McDonald is one of our moderators in our chat. They're a good friend of ours. We know him personally. He just said something that kind of caught us as funny. He said he took a ridiculously difficult trip once, and the only reason he went was because there was a search and rescue guy with him. If you've go back far enough in our episodes, we talk about this a little bit more in depth, but the very short story is Ben was the one that drug him on this trip. So, and it was a very difficult trip that Steve learned a lot of interesting things on.
Yeah. Yeah. So you learn a lot about your limits when someone pushes you.
But I mean, that's all still good information. Tying it back into our conversation, I assume, Steve, and I'm hoping not putting words in your mouth here, from that experience, you could go back and recalculate what your limits were and what potentially the gear and stuff was you wanted to take the next time you were into a trip like that, which, much like as Matthew's saying over here, is basically what the military does full time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Uh, Sometimes I'll tell people I'm not a survival expert, but I've done everything wrong before, and so I can tell you how not to do like I've suffered so many nights in the wilderness being beat up by just extreme temperatures, insects, the cold, being wet. I've suffered so many times that I hate, and I really hate suffering, and I like enjoying the woods. So what makes me an expert is not that I'm maybe not an expert, but it's that I've done everything wrong and I can tell you how to not do it wrong, right? And eventually you become an expert because I've done everything there is to do wrong. So
No,
yeah, that's sort of how you learn
we
survival.
say something similar. We say we have learned all the improper ways to do stuff.
Yeah.
So
you'll never live long enough to make every mistake, so learn from some other people's.
Yes. That's the point of survival training, is just, learning from other people's mistakes.
So, a question for me, just from listening to what you've been saying here. So, the research that the military started, obviously, this you said, World War One, it came about, or the next evolution off. It was basically during guerrilla warfare, when we had a lot more guys, boots on the ground, we were fighting our wars in trenches and on foot, and with short range combat and stuff like that. Before they sent these folks over, and I don't know if you know this or not, how much research did they do to prepare these folks for going out to these new environments from the primitive skills?
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that. I know that prior to World War II, and during World War II, there were schools that some troops would go to, and they were more specialized schools. Like you had maybe like a mountains type school, right? You did have some sort of outdoor training, and I don't really know the training for specifically for World War I or II troops, but it wasn't until after World War II that an official survival school, as we think of it, was created. And to mine from the book, it's called Art of Survival by Cord Christian Troebst. That's Troebst. It's called The Art of Survival. German, I believe it's a German author. It's been translated really well into English. But he reports that the very first survival school was in Carson, Colorado. It was shortly thereafter moved to Stead Air Force Base in Nevada, and it started around 1952. And the purpose of that was really for pilots who, because they found in World War II that pilots would either crash or have to ditch their plane, and then they would die after the fact. So they would actually survive the crash, they'd get to the ground, and then they'd have no idea how to survive after that. They would either freeze to death, or if they were in the jungle, they would starve, or in the desert, they would die from heat stroke. So the very first survival school was for pilots, and that's when you had the first sort of central point for information to flow to. So then they start interviewing pilots. They start interviewing victims of sea disasters, right? You get your ship you're on sinks and you're a life raft survivor for a month. They started asking people, what were the biggest challenges? What was it like being out there? And that's when survival sort of, a lot of protocols started coming in, survival equipment, right? Started being manufactured to meet these challenges and issues.
Do you have a thought on that, Ben? It looked like you were about to say something there.
No, I'm just thinking of some of the things, like if you just matching up with what he was saying, if you look at how the rescue craft or the emergency craft almost all have like a cover, and I don't think they used to. Years ago, you get a dory with no cover, no way of getting yourself out of the sun, and people wouldn't have thought that was a big thing, but exposure killed a lot more people than starvation, and even like other things. But yeah, no, it's pilots, and then later on I know they brought the airborne in, so they dumped people on the other side, and they had to know how to get the hell out of there, get back to the right.
No, that's where my knowledge comes in. I know, like, into the military, or I think I know, it was the bush pilots, as you said. I thought that's maybe where a lot of the survivalist stuff spawned from, because just my own primitive research on this, it, like you said, it was mostly the bush pilots and stuff like that. If their planes went down, their landing environments, one, they were generally not super familiar with, because they were flying, rather long distances to go fight these wars, or, the plane carriers or stuff like that were taking them to new countries and they weren't ready for the environment. Um, or they were just going down on native soil and basically just didn't know how to get out of there, how to get help and stuff like that. And that's where the training came in that I was aware of. Before we loop back, there was one comment here that Steve made in about our little joke there, but he makes a good point, and I think you might like this one too, Matthew. He said, yes, for sure, learned a lot about his limits. Also learned he could push through them far more than he ever thought. And this is coming back to something Ben has said a long time ago in one of our things there, Ben, and I think I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So go ahead. You can explain it. It's your saying.
So what I was taught, and it seems to be true, I haven't proven it wrong yet, is when you think you can absolutely go no further, you are about half as far as you can go. So your body will naturally start telling you, I'm exhausted, I can't go another step. But the reality is you're only about halfway there. Your body keeps about enough reserve to return from whatever you went. That will also mean that at that point, you probably truly are going to be exhausted. You'll be days and recover. But yeah. The other thing I've seen, and you mentioned frostbite, is I didn't do it. I kind of refused because I don't like being cold. But there was a researcher that came to our search and rescue group and actually had most of our members dunk themselves into a frozen lake. So they cut a hole and they dunked them in, and they did rescues for a whole day. And the doctor actually told them some really interesting facts. And one was the energy it takes for you to, after falling into frozen water, is about the same energy as it takes to run a marathon.
Wow.
So if you drop 2 or 3 degrees body temperature, which is a lot really, it takes a ton of energy to pull you back. So you will be flat out exhausted that night. And these guys were, everyone to a man told me, they said the next day they were zonked, and it's that recovery. But it's through programs like that, because the government didn't stop, but they learned a lot in World War One, because World War One, I know they sent a ton of soldiers over that were fresh, volunteers from the United States, from Canada, from all the Commonwealth countries that went to Europe to fight with no knowledge. Like they were given a gun and the bare necessities, and they realized, we were losing way too many men. We had too much. So there was research on it, and there was some training. I don't know how much, but you alluded to it, for World War II, but there was nothing for World War One. People went so fresh, it was unbelievable.
So
then we learned you absolutely can't do that.
Just a thought on the cold water stuff there before we leave it too far behind. As a follower that's had both frostbite and hypothermia from being in cold water, and Ben, you might have heard of this program through Search and Rescue. Have you ever heard of Cold Water Boot Camp?
It's probably, I think so. I think that's probably.
So one of the things they teach in this cold water boot camp, and once upon a time, for most first responders, I think this was a free course, and since it's gone paid, and they may have changed curriculum. But something that always stuck to me from that, and this might be something interesting for you, Matt, because a little different environment, is they use a 1-10-1 rule for when you hit cold water, and cold water's, anything I think below 5 degrees Celsius or something like that. You have 1 minute to catch your breath, because otherwise if you don't catch, when you dump in cold water, and I'm sure both use, cold shower, stuff like that, you kind of get this suck-in reflex. So you have 1 minute to catch your breath and kind of get control of that, because otherwise you'll start hyperventilating, you could slip under the water, and you could expire. So after your 1 minute to catch your breath, you got 10 minutes of meaningful movement or dexterity with your fingers and your fingers and feet. So if you're going to try and self-rescue yourself out of ice or something like that, you got about 10 minutes to do it before your hands and feet will go so numb that you won't actually realize you're kicking your feet, or you'll no longer be able to claw yourself up onto the ice. After that, you actually have about an hour, providing you're not, starfished out or something like that. Most people go into a C position where their legs come together, it goes under the ice, and they kind of hold on top. And as first responders, this is how we find a lot of people. But anyway, from that point, you actually have about an hour before you get into severe hypothermia. You can hit mild hypothermia, but it's about an hour. And this is, once again, general guides don't if you're playing in the Arctic at minus 50 and hop in the water, guarantee you it's going to be way less than an hour. But general guide, it's about an hour before you get into severe hypothermia, to the point where you're probably going to be in the hospital for several weeks, and they got to balance you out to try and bring you back and things like that. So just 1-10-1. The important ones is the 1 and the 10. Hopefully you get out way faster than the last one, but try and get your breathing under control within that 1 minute so you don't hyperventilate, and then you're only going to have about 10 useful minutes of movement to self-rescue. And this is in most shock cold environments, so jumping in water being the number one thing there. But even I've seen people go into the shock reflex in blast freezers and stuff like that. Going into or putting me through high school, I worked in a lobster plant, and we had a blast freezer in there that would go from like room temperature to minus 160 in 2 minutes or something like that. Like these things are massively cold really fast. So just food for thought. I don't know if either of you folks ever heard of that.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the physiology of. Actually, in the book I showed you, Essentials of Sea Survival, they talk about that, the automatic sort of inhale response and sort of what to do.
And there's a fancy term for it, but I can't think of it.
Yeah, I can't think of the name either. But yeah, about 3 years ago, I stumbled upon Morse Kahansky's Grand Syllabus. And we talked about Morse Kahansky. I'm sure your listeners are all familiar because he is, Canadian, who was Canadian, passed away December 2019, I believe. Or it could have been somewhere around there. But anyway, his Grand Syllabus is a small little booklet that lists, a whole lifetime's worth of skills in the order that he, in like a order. And the goal of it is not to teach you the skills, but it's to have a list of everything a wilderness living skills instructor should know. And what I did is about 3 years ago, I started going through it one by one. And rather than just doing what I'd done the previous 7 years, which was really a hop around skill to skill, never really know what I wanted to accomplish, never really have a specific topic and stick with it for months at a time, I started getting on one topic and just really holding on to that topic for months. And the very first topic was defining survival and exposure. And so I started researching the history of survival. And when I say history, I mean a lot of it is books with survival accounts. So you're seeing either accounts of death or near death in the wilderness, and then you're learning everything you can from how people have died or near death experiences. And I also learned about the exposure. So I learned about the human body in extreme cold and the human body in extreme heat, and living in the desert here where it gets 115, which I think is 30, 38 or, I don't know how Celsius, but hotter than you ever imagine. Let's put it that way. It's been a big help, but I really held on to that topic for a long time. And I learned about the psychology. And then what I started doing was, and I would recommend everyone does this, instead of jumping from topic to topic, start with like the most basic bushcraft skills like fire making, and just stick to it until you are so good at making a fire that you can do it. And just don't stop doing that one skill, because a lot of survival and bushcraft people who really want to get good at these skills, they're too much generalists. Mm-hmm. They try to learn a little bit of every topic, a little bit of basket weaving, a little bit of shelter building, a little bit here and there, rather than getting really, really, really good at just a few things. You only need to be really good at like maybe 5 or 6 different topics. And it's kind of like Karate Kid, where he teaches them the basics first, wax on, wax off. You learn the basics and you just do the basics over and over and over, and you'll be 100 times better than the person who doesn't have a set goal in mind when they start to train, and doesn't have a training sort of program to go through, even if it's your own self-made program.
So something you mentioned when you were starting there, when you were researching the history of survival and bushcraft, you said you read a lot of books, and there were accounts of like near-death experiences or deaths and stuff like that. And I got a spark in my thoughts too that a lot of the books I own here, they're based on, that are Canadian made for sure. They're based on like old trappers. They used to be fur trappers, set up trapping huts and stuff like that, or they would be Alaskan gold miners or something like that, where they're trying to survive in these harsh environments. And much like yourself, I never really thought about it before. That's exactly what they are. They're either accounts of when people died or almost died. You know what I mean? And they'll,
Yeah.
the foreword in the book will be like, this is the time I basically almost died in Alaska from freezing to death. And, basically the whole way out of the book, it's going to be how to not freeze to death in Alaska, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Anyway, it was just
Yeah.
a funny thought.
Yeah, it's definitely, and all of this, when I talk about all of the research and stuff, it obviously comes from a place of, I have a lot of experience in the field. So I didn't really start reading, and getting into I was always into the books, but I never really did a deep dive into the literature until after I already had a lot of experience under my belt. So I think for people who already have a lot of experience outdoors, I think it's greatly underestimated how much you can learn from reading as an outdoorsman, and how much practical information you can find that will actually help you in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no substitute for research. I mean, getting the practical side is very important, and you have to, like you said, practice those basic skills. But kind of understanding where it comes from and why it's important, I think, really makes it great. And a lot of people get tied up in the gimmicks, like the fire steel. That became super popular a few years ago. Everyone had to have the ferro rods or whatever. But you can get the greatest ferro rod in the world. You can get the greatest lighter in the world, greatest match in the world. If you don't know basic fire starting skills, you're just wasting tools.
You can have a blowtorch, and if you don't know how to build a fire, you're not getting a fire going.
Yeah. We've had gasoline before and a lighter and couldn't get a fire going.
Yeah,
Been there,
right?
done that.
That's real. That's real.
You watch a guy with like a 2-foot diameter log trying to light the thing from one corner, and you're like, man,
Yep.
you missed something here, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of the gimmicks that have been coming up, and I've, as much as I carry a ferro rod, I've never actually had to use one in 10 years. My lighter's never not worked, and
it's amazing
but there's been
how
times
many fires you can get out of one of these things.
you can get a lot. They're not going to run out. Yeah, they're not going to. Most of the time, they're not going to break either. But you definitely, if you're not, there's been times I couldn't, early, not anymore these days, but when I was starting out, you have a lighter and you still can't get a fire going. You can have the best survival pack in the world and die before a single item comes out because you did something wrong.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
and that just
we had a good story years ago. A guy who had the ice picks. He had him in his backpack and he was walking across the ice, and he falls through the ice and he drowned. He drowned because he couldn't get his ice picks out. And they could tell he was trying to get his pack off to get to his picks. And that's how he sunk. And so they said, like, when you're walking across ice, the picks should be in your hands because it's too late to pull them out after the fact. They need to be either really accessible or in your hands. A lot of these tools need to be used in the right time. Without that forethought, without you're setting yourself up for a failure.
Yeah.
So one
Yeah,
little
good.
question from, sorry, Matt, not to cut you off again, bud, but so Chris Lovelace is just asking, any plans on writing any books or manuals yourself? And I do know you have your school there, but the book question's kind of interesting. You're going to work on your own survival book eventually? Is that end goal, or?
I've definitely thought about it. I'm actually working on a book right now called Sonoran Desert Foraging. So it's the edible plants of southern Arizona. I may do a survival manual someday. I'm very I don't want to write a book that's already been done. I don't want to just reproduce a compilation of what everyone else already sort of has done before. So I think if I do write a survival book, hopefully it'll be something, I want it to be something new to add to the world of survival that would be beneficial and not just a reproduction. But, I think I think at this point in my career, I do have enough I think a lot of the knowledge out there in survival is not at the forefront. I always say that survival books today are mostly made for teenage boys. That's what's at the front of everyone's attention. There are some exceptions,
no,
of course.
I get what you mean. It's
but you know what I mean, right? They're kind of just like,
true it is with some of the more populated newsprint books.
Yeah. 101 ways to survive, and it's like tornado, how to survive an alligator attack. It's like, okay, come on, like let's get some real stuff here. So I think, but some of the books, man, from the 60s and 70s and 80s that just have fallen out of they're not on the recommended survival book list on Amazon, so no one sees them. But it's like, can I really even do better than some of these like classics from the 80s? Just because people don't read them, the only thing that it would do is that it would be like if I made a book like that, it would be advertised. So maybe it would be more likely to land in your hands than some of the classics. But there's so many good classics that people just don't know about.
I was going to say,
you know what used to be a really good source that nobody, and the new versions I don't like as much, but the old Popular Mechanics.
yeah,
There was some really cool stuff in those old Popular Mechanics from the early '80s and maybe even, I don't know when they started, but we had the encyclopedias from the '70s with them, and there is really cool stuff that they cover in these things, and great information. But yeah, you're right. You don't see it now. Although I have it, and I think it's funny. Like it's all like how to survive a zombie attack. It's like,
yeah, it's sort of the curse of the internet where we're in this weird like sort of era in human history where you have a lot of instant experts, and because information is at our fingertips, people are more okay with surface level information than ever before, I feel like, because you don't have to go to the library and read a book on the topic. You can just watch a WikiHow or a quick YouTube video. So people think that, oh, like I've had people say like, I have a foraging course with a bunch of videos. They're like, I can just get it on YouTube for free. And I'm just like, oh man, if you only knew what you were saying, like you cannot get my course on YouTube for free. Like none of the stuff I produce, I mean, some of it, sure, some of it you can find on YouTube, but I'm just like, it's just a different level than YouTube, information. It is what it is. And I think with the instant information, we actually are more lazy as a society than ever before to actually master something. And people feel like they're masters of something after 2 or 3 months because they know more about it than the people around them. But really it's like, it's kind of sad because you actually have access to get the books, right? This is the only time in human history you could go on, you just Google a book and I can have a list of the 100 survival books from the 40s all the way to the current day. And I can have all of them at my door, but people don't do that because they're like, oh, well, I just want to get it for free. And I just want to, and they're really missing. And that's with almost every topic, but with almost every topic, but for me, foraging and survival, you just can't learn it online, like in the same way that you can with books and with heavy research. And it's sort of sad that people with more access to information than ever, actually, they just don't ever go further than the first couple layers of a topic,
Well, something funny on this point that I tell a lot of people is, this instant access information. Think of it this way, taking, the information out of it and looking at it with a different analogy is, once upon a time, and I don't know if this is the standard, but this has come from the 90s, early 2000s, was to be an Olympian or to go to an Olympic level, you need 10,000 plus hours of experience in whatever sport or field you're into. That's just to be an expert to even get a chance at trying to be, go to the Olympics. Think of bushcraft or survival or anything like that as it's just another skill. You need tons of hours into this before you can consider yourself any kind of expert. I mean, Ben and I together probably have a couple thousand hours into this, and we straight up say, like, we are not experts. We are a couple of guys that can tell you how we have screwed up in the past, much like yourself. And then you'll get people that are literally have watched, I'll be generous, say 15 hours worth of YouTube videos, and they're like, yep, I'm ready to go survive in the woods, and they've never set foot in the woods before. And you see them trotting off, and you're like, okay, I see enough stuff there to last you until you get to the woods, and then what you gonna do? But it's the lack of experience, the lack of actually studying it, the lack of the hours being put in before they ever went into the woods. It's one of those things, especially survival on your end. You're playing with your life in certain situations. You want to gamble that far into it.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed in my own personal life, there seems to be this breakthrough moment where you actually start to become I can tell you when you start to become like knowledgeable at a topic. So the way the process works for me with foraging or survival is you learn so much that you start feeling like an expert, and a lot of people stop there. But it's when you start feeling like an expert, you know, and then once you keep going though, you sort of break through this level, and at a certain point the realization hits you on how much you don't know, and you start feeling like you know nothing. That's when you've actually turned into sort of an intermediate level, is when you actually admit to yourself that even after 5 or 10 years of doing it, you actually know very little. That's the mark of an expert, because an expert is someone who's never above learning from other people, even people much, much less experienced than them. And a lot of these people online, they don't want to learn from anybody. And so I think hopefully to the day I die, I'll be learning from people who are much less experienced than me. But you always have to keep an open mind, and you can't think you know it all. It definitely in survival, or you'll get humbled very quickly by an 8-year-old will tell you something you didn't know or correct you, and so.
Yeah, those 8 years. My mother used to say something: "Never be too good to be told something," and it's shockingly good, because we've said it before. It's always interesting where you'll learn something that you never thought you would have. You'll be talking to somebody, you think they would know nothing on the subject. All of a sudden, they know way more than you'd have expected. And yeah, if you want to learn what somebody can teach you from YouTube, it means you have to watch a video, go out, and do that thing. And if you want to learn, say, 50 plants from YouTube, it's going to take you hundreds of hours. Or you go with somebody who knows what they're doing and sit there, and they're going to show you things. They're going to get you to touch things. They're going to get you to really see the little differences, because you can learn a lot from a book, but until you put your hands on it, until you add all these different things together, you don't truly get it. The first few times I went for looking for different plants like chaga, the first couple I looked at, I wouldn't even touch. I said, I don't know that's what it is. And I'd go back and talk to people and ask questions, and like, okay, I did find it. But then I have to go back and find it again. There's a bunch of other plants. The chicken of the woods was a really interesting one for me. But all these things take time to learn. And other plants that I grew up knowing because my family harvested them for years. I kind of knew those early. But it takes a lot to learn this stuff. You're 100%.
So, gentlemen,
just so you guys know, we have 7 minutes.
I was just about to say, we're coming up on 7 minutes. So we either have to make a decision if we want to wrap this up, or we can just keep on going, but we'll just have to take a 30-second recess here while we refresh our stuff. So what's your guys' thoughts on this? I'm good with continuing on for a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to continue.
Kind of relies on you, Matthew. Do you got the time to keep entertaining us? We shoot for an hour show, but we've had shows that go significantly longer. So anybody that's out there listening in the comments and the viewers that are still there, if you folks would just hold on for a couple seconds, we will be right back. We just have to refresh some stuff, and then we'll hit this again. All our audio inputs shut off. Try that again. So we're back. Just a momentary break, intermission, whatever you want to call it, while we sorted some stuff out there, and we're good to keep on floating. So, where did we end off there, Ben? You were on a thought, and I unfortunately had to cut you off, buddy. So, do you want to keep on going on your thought?
Nope, lost it.
Sorry about that, bud. But anyway, what we were talking about was the instantaneous information, and we had a few stories that we pitched in on there. So, can you keep going on your thought where you're at there, Matthew? Or
Yeah. I mean, well, we sort of we're at the end of a thought. Are there any comments from the audience or questions or anything that on any maybe sort of start a new conversation up?
honestly, most people are just telling us to keep going. That
Keep
they're
going.
interested
Okay.
in it and they're liking it. So, all right, let's go this way. So we talked about how the military has evolved survival a lot since the, I think you said First World War, like we said, guerrilla warfare and stuff like that. So prior to that, what's your knowledge on like the primitive skills and stuff like that? You said you did a little reading on it. I know you said like the indigenous peoples and stuff. As most people know, that's where a lot of our skills started from. And I do know, depending on the area and the indigenous peoples that lived in those areas, really dictated what the skills were that were passed along.
Yeah.
I assume most of those were just passed by word of mouth. When did the actual like any insight on when documented? I know you said the first school was there a while ago, but what about documented training to try and pass some of the stuff forward?
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. So one of my biggest areas of study, probably my primary area of study in all of this, is the study of ethnobotany. Okay. Ethnobotany is the study of how people use plants, and in particular, my even defining it even further would be edible plants. And so, when you start researching um, edible plants is not really a science. It's so whenever you sort of are asking yourself, is this plant edible? You're not looking at scientific studies, you're looking at historical accounts. That's mostly 99% of the time how we know a plant is edible is was it used throughout history. And so, depending on the plant, you may be looking at history of China, the history of the Philippines, the European history, depending on where the plant is originally from. But most of the plants here in the U.S. and Canada, of course, are native. So you're looking at the historical accounts, and it's interesting because 99% of the historical accounts are not written by the the Indians or the Native Americans themselves. They're written by people who came after and studied and interviewed them, ethnobotanists, right? Um, and so it's really interesting. The skills that Europeans had when they came to the New World and their way of living and lifestyle is vastly different from the Native Americans' way of living and lifestyle. And so a lot of the information was lost, especially I think in the eastern U.S. Because that's where the first place it was settled, and it was kind of unfortunately kind of like get out of here, this is our land. So there wasn't a whole lot of interest in study necessarily. Of course, a lot of the information on edible plants we still have, but then you get into the western U.S. where I feel like the Native Americans there was a lot more study and into the western tribes. So you have really great ethnobotany books on the Sonoran Desert. You have it on the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, British Columbia interior as well, and a lot of the western tribes. So yeah, so it's really interesting. The primitive technology is different, I think, from the bushcraft of the pioneers in the colonial era because of the deep knowledge of plants and also the different techniques, but the deep knowledge of just living with the land on how to use plants for clothing, medicine, food, adhesives, how to just make the fiber arts, right? They're just the fiber arts of every tribe is slightly different. How they weave baskets, how they weave clothing, and how they make various tools and things like that. So a lot of the primitive living skills are a lot more advanced. So a lot of them are not something that you can just go do on a weekend anytime you want. A lot of the materials for bushcraft, as you both know, are highly seasonal, right? You want to harvest birch bark at a certain time. You want to harvest willow bark at a certain time for rope and, different basket materials. and they're also just more advanced. A lot of them as well are not super practical for a survival situation. You're primitive and you're not going to go make a stone knife really quick to skin a deer that you trapped with a dog bane fiber noose or something, right? Those are the types of things that are very advanced and more of a hobby at this point than practical skills you can. I mean, they're practical, but not a skill you can just do on the fly. So that's a really interesting, topic. And see if I have another book on that. I showed you the one. This is a really great book with some of the primitive skills, survival skills of native California by Paul Campbell. You would almost call it applied archaeology. So it's like archaeologists who don't stop at just looking at the past, but they want to mimic it, and they want to talk to people who are still practicing those types of skills, and still making bows, still making throwing sticks to hunt rabbits with, and it's a lot of fun. But getting into the edible plant side, that's where all of the best information comes from, is not from the modern day on edible plants, but it's from history, because obviously the average person today doesn't forage, or they're not still eating all of these plants. So we have to look at who ate them in the past. Yeah.
So, just a quick thing from the side here, which kind of ties into the planting. First of all, let's say, personally, he's too scared to try plants and wild edibles. There's so many varieties.
All right, I think we got some feedback in the background.
I think it was just a car going by. Was that
okay?
Traffic going by there, Ben?
Maybe it's
All right, I'll start again. So anyway, personally, too scared to try wild plants and edibles. There's so many varieties of each type of plant that two plants can look identical, but one can be poisonous and one can be completely safe. And the identifying factors are like the shape of the leaf or the time of year and stuff like that. And this kind of goes back to what we said before. This is kind of where you can get, well, first of all, this is Matt's specialty, but my own 2 cents on this. This is where that, instantaneous gratification or instantaneous information really can bite you in the butt. People will start looking at a couple websites or a couple videos, think they're experts on these edible things, and then go out there and they can make themselves very sick. This is definitely one of those areas where you want to put the time in. And Ben is a massive advocate for this of, if you're going to learn wild edibles, pick one plant. And what else does he say, Ben? Identify it through all 4 seasons in your local area or something like that.
That's the way to start. I mean, if you try to say, I'm going to go out and learn everything today, you're going to overwhelm yourself. That's not to say you won't pick up more as you go. You're going to, because when you learn to identify one plant, you generally have to learn how to prove there's other plants aren't that plant. So you're going to learn more. But yeah, I mean, there's exceptions to this rule too. But if you're doing it completely on your own, choose one plant and choose a plant that's probably most plentiful for the area you're going to be in, and really learn to identify that full year around, and then move on to the next. One of the things they talk about in survival is if you find a plant that's maybe edible, but there's only a few of them, it's not worth your effort. No point in learning a plant that you can't get enough of. You're looking for something that there's a plenty of that you might be able to eat.
So, kind of tying it all together, what Ben and Matt are saying here is, Ben saying work on one plant, Matt says work on one skill. There's a lot of similarities here, you know what I mean? Learn one thing and progress through that before you overwhelm yourself. That's what Ben just said right there is it's a key point. I think you'd agree on that too, Matthew. Like, you don't want to get overwhelmed by trying to learn 50 plants. Pick one. Learn as much as you can about that. Become an expert on that plant. Don't become an expert on wild edibles. Become an expert on said plant and then move on. And then become an expert on several edibles. And then eventually you can, be okay with wild edibles.
Yeah, and when it comes to wild edibles, there's no 2 plants that look identical, right? There's always there's 2 plants maybe that look almost identical at certain times of the year, but then they put out flowers and the flowers look completely different from each other. So I would say start with plants that look distinct. Whenever you're going through pictures of plants, there's going to be always, most of the time a plant has something that pops out at you. What is that thing that pops out at you? And not all plants are super distinct to a beginner, but there's always going to be like a rose hip, right? Rose hips have those long little things, sort of like the bottom of an apple, but they're longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really distinct. Currants sort of have like a clear almost appearance, and they have that little thing that's kind of the leftover little remnants on the bottom of it. It makes it really distinct. Start with fruit trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs, they're a lot easier to identify than stuff all over the ground, herbs all over the ground. Start with trees. There's a lot less toxic trees and shrubs, and most of the parts you're eating off a tree and shrub is the fruit. The fruit's really the most distinct part of a tree usually, right? You're not going to mistake a blueberry, most likely. You're definitely not going to mistake a blackberry or a currant or a rosehip or a Saskatoon berry or a hazelnut, right? Those are really the distinct fruiting part of the plant. So start with trees and shrubs and, work your way, but start with all the really distinct looking plants. Your bergamot, things that have a really distinct smell, wild onion, right? Some of those that are easy. If one's just tricky, then don't be in a rush to eat it. Just skip over it and keep an eye on it until next year.
So going down this path, Chris Loveless, not that far out of the desert himself, lives near northern Nevada desert. He asks, are there any desert foods I should try to look out for, Matthew, to get started with wild edibles? So any
desert foods that you to look out for?
Something that's easy, I think, is what he's looking for. Something that he could learn on. A place to start.
Yeah. Oh, well, the desert of Nevada is a pretty barren desert. The Great Basin's a pretty barren area of wild food. But you could look up a book online called Botany of Survival. Okay, Botany of Survival by Brian Phillips. And that's actually an online book. It actually I might be giving you a little bit more than you're asking for, because that is a massive, huge online book. It's like almost like 1,000 pages or more of edible plants. But it does organize it by family. It's all completely for free online. Great pictures. So I would say pick a family with a lot of fruit plants in it, like the rose family, maybe, and then just go from there. Also, you can look up range maps to see that's another thing that I think is helpful, that it only takes a little bit of time. Once you learn how to do it, it's pretty quick. That I think would save a lot of people time foraging is looking up range maps and to see if the plant you're looking at even grows in your area, right? Because if it doesn't grow in your area, there's no point in learning it. It only takes 1 minute to really look up a range map of a plant you read about in a book. You just have to know the scientific name, which is always going to be in the book attached, right? Mm-hmm. And you can I share my screen by any chance?
I think so.
I don't know. We've never tried. Potentially.
All right. Let's try it.
If you can share it over there, I can get it over here, Ben.
Let's see. There we go.
Stand by, ladies and gentlemen. We're trying new.
There we go.
Full browser. Let's
give him a second to get it onto YouTube.
Can you see?
Go ahead.
I can see something. Just give us a second.
You'll get it up there in a second. In the meantime, I remember blueberry picking in Newfoundland and finding a berry that looked like a blueberry, but the plant was obviously not blueberries. And we used to avoid it because we had no idea what it was, but it was much more rare. Like the blueberries were plentiful, and this other plant that grew on a longer, straighter stem and had a blueberry-like appearance. We always knew enough to stay away from it. Not that it was necessarily poisonous, we just didn't know. And it was too rare to make any effort to try to harvest it.
So your screen's up there
it
now,
says that I'm... Can people see my screen?
Yes, they can, sir.
Okay. So a couple of little things here you can do to find for range maps. I mean, this is like really easy stuff. I'm about to teach a lesson on it recorded for my foraging students. But what you can do is you can go if you're in the U.S., you can use a website called, I forget what it stands for, but it's BONAP, BONAP. It's like the Biotic North America Plant Atlas. That's what it stands for. So what you do is you type in the genus name of the plant, followed by the search term BONAP. And the very first link, it will, if you live in the US, it will show you where all of the different species of that plant grow. So real easy win for people in the US. If you happen to live in Canada, you can go to this website, and there's multiple versions of this, but they're all connected. So it doesn't matter. You just go to swbiodiversity.org, and we'll do the same thing. We'll look up Celtis. How about Celtis reticulata, the netleaf hackberry? And check this out. It's pretty cool. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yep, sure can.
So you look up a plant, you got to have the whole scientific name. You can do here, open interactive map. And then an actual range map will come up of the plant. So pretty cool. You can see all where it grows. What's a good Canadian plant, edible plants up there we should look up?
Ooh,
Cloudberry.
yeah.
Cloudberry? Okay. What's this? I don't know the scientific name of cloudberry. What you'll do is you'll type in cloudberry scientific name. Oops. Oh, here it is. Then you'll copy and paste that. We'll go back to our search bar, pop that in really quick. And then it has an interactive map, so we'll open it up. And if you read about cloudberry in a book, let's see if it goes up into Canada or not. Oh, it sure does. And then now you can know. Can you guys see it?
Yep.
Funny thing is, I know it grows in Sweden.
Okay, I'm curious what those ones are. Those must be islands right there between the two seas, I assume.
Yeah. So there you go. And you can do that with almost any plant will be on this website. You can just look it up. So if you have another one, say again.
Slide over so you can see Newfoundland if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we used to harvest that growing up. It was kind of an interesting one. It's an interesting plant. But I was always told it didn't have the range it has. But wow, it does have a lot more range.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah. And then, so I go to Northern Bushcraft to learn about plants of your region. You can go here and you can see all of the different Canadian provinces here, and you can click on berries. Berries are the easiest, right? And then plants. So click on berries, and then you can go down the whole list of berries, and it'll have pictures and species names and everything. So you can just, if you live in Canada, you could use this website, northernbushcraft.com. And if you, list 4 species here, right? And so if you want to know which ones are in your area, just copy and paste it, pop it up in your Southwest biodiversity, just like this, and open the interactive map for that species. And well, now it's not wanting to work, but I think it's because I'm sharing. It's not wanting to work, but
yeah,
I think you get the point.
It gets a little goofy that way.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, right there is Northern Bushcraft. You can go through all of the, over 100 plants in that website, see, and then do that super quick. Just open the map for each one, and then maybe look at the top 10 that you want to learn about, and just that grow in your area and go from there.
Yeah, and I think that's important. Start with the ones that are most plentiful, and then work your way from there. I think the reason a lot of people get afraid of this stuff is if you remember the movie Into the Wild, and it was about this guy, Christopher Candless. He went up in Alaska. I think the bus might still be up there. They only recently removed it. And he thought he was getting some kind of wild sweet pea, but he actually found a wild potato, and the seeds were poisonous. And it led to his downfall. And it was because the 2 plants were close enough, and all he had was an old field guide, and he didn't really pay attention to the warnings. And so,
yeah, it's actually an interesting story. Christopher McCandless's story. Let's see if I have the book right here. Somewhere around here.
I honestly love
Samuel
how you were
Fair.
a walking encyclopedia or library, whichever way you want to look at it. Just you name these books and you have them. It's great. I love it.
Well, Samuel Thayer did a whole in his book Nature's Garden, he did a whole thing on the Christopher McCandless story and basically proved that he did not actually die from poisoning. It was the author of the that came out, Dr. Crowker or something. I don't know how to pronounce his name. He basically wrote and he sort of speculated that he got poisoned due to an anti-nutrient or something like that. And Thayer actually goes to lengths to disprove. The autopsy report said that he starved to death, and he starved to death. That's how he died. And so I think the purpose of that is not to say that people never get poisoned, but he has this whole chapter on just that story and talks about how I think he even went and ate some of those peas that specific species that Christopher McCandless had eaten, just to sort of prove a point and be like, hey, I actually ate these. But it's interesting that I think there's a lot. The point of me saying that is there's a lot of fear surrounding the world of foraging that is unnecessary. People do definitely kill themselves. They definitely eat poison hemlock and kill themselves. But there's people, if you're afraid of poisoning yourself, you're probably not going to poison yourself. It's the people who have no fear at all are the ones who are actually in danger.
So,
but it's unfortunate. I think the movies like that, which propagate some of these fears that make people even more terrified of some of this stuff. Because it's one of the things when I see people think of that's one of the movies that jumped up my mind, and a lot of people who get into this watch these things and then they're like, oh, that's a thing, right? And you're right. It's possible to eat something that might poison you, but
and the reason he wrote a chapter on the book is, and I know why, as a foraging instructor, you hear the name Christopher McCandless, or more often, that one guy in Alaska. You hear that, I've probably heard it 100 times. And so I'm sure Samuel Thayer has too, which is why he wrote a whole chapter on it, or a whole section. But it's interesting how much fear there is around wild food in this country when, other countries, it's foraging is like a commonplace. It's because we don't grow up doing it. And sure, there's a fear. I mean, I can't lie and say I haven't been afraid. At the first 200 plants I ate, I was afraid a little bit, right?
Well, you never know. You know what I mean? Until you know, you don't know. There's always a little fear there. But on that note, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's even laws in some places that won't let you forage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Which... And there's other countries or places where it's not only perfectly legal, it's protected. So it's not all one place or another. Like, you have to understand where you're to, what the limitations are. But
yeah, I'm going to turn my light on really quick for you.
Sure. If you can hear me there, Matthew, what my question was I know with a lot of things that can potentially give you rashes or things like that, like plants and stuff, and the one that's coming to mind is like poison oak, poison sumac, poison ivy being the big common one. Generally, there's something in the local vicinity that can neutralize some of that stuff. In the case of poison ivy, jewelweed's a common one that'll help. You know what I mean? Is that the same to say with edibles? Or I know that's a lot more dangerous. But is there potentially things you should be looking for in coexistence with some of these things in case it's like, oh my God, I ate this berry, it's going to give me, massive runs or something like that? In the same area, is there generally a counteractant, or is that more so for like the topical stuff?
Yeah, jewelweed's an interesting example because there's something in it that binds with the skin more aggressively than the urushiol, or however you say it, oil in poison ivy. So it binds so aggressively to whatever it is it's binding to that the poison ivy oils can't cling to your skin or something like that. It's interesting. I would say no, I don't know of anything like that. I do know that the military, I do believe, would recommend charcoal.
I was going to say charcoal I know is a big fallback on a lot of things. But I just know maybe there was, a botany side of this as well.
No, not that I'm aware of. A lot of, if you
and
eat
that's a fair question.
You're probably...
I mean, that's a completely fair statement. This wasn't a loaded question. I was genuinely curious.
Yeah. I don't know how well charcoal will work. I think I was watching a documentary on like survival training in the Marines, and they had said something like that. But I don't think I've ever read that anywhere in a foraging book, though.
What was it? Was it vitamin C? I think it was that crickets. Was it crickets? Vitamin C deficiency.
I'm not sure.
It used to be so people coming over from Europe to come here. The British used to. The reason they're called limeys is because they carried lime because it was high in vitamin
Give me one
C.
sec, Jim.
And a lot of the first settlers I know in Newfoundland and those places, they actually died from lack of certain vitamins. And the solution to it was food that was readily available, weeds that were growing around it. They would literally tear up and throw away. And they just didn't know it was edible, so they didn't eat it. So one of the examples I remember was dandelions have more vitamin C per weight than an orange. The leaves.
Yeah.
You know, learning that stuff. And the funny thing is the natives in the area fully knew that. They fully knew that those plants were edible and useful.
Yeah,
Plants,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and we may have talked about this last time, but edible wild plants are generally higher in nutrients, vitamins, and nutrients than store-bought vegetables for a number of reasons. The nutrients are stripped out of the soil in farms, right? And they're adding back just the bare minimum nutrients that they need. Also, the genetics of plants have been altered to increase the shelf life and make the plants bigger, which doesn't necessarily always, allow them to keep their their nutrients. Also, by the time you even are eating vegetables from the store, they've probably been on a truck for at least some amount of time, or they're not fresh from the ground at that point, right? You're eating week-old vegetables our whole lives, or a lot of fruit or unripe fruit that ripen after picking. So, but in general, you'd be amazed at, just as a general rule, wild edible plants are extremely high in nutrients compared to the store-bought counterparts.
I was going to say, I was still kind of listening there. One of the big things I was surprised off was, and maybe you know this one, Matthew, is yellow birch buds. The very first buds that come out of a yellow birch, pound for pound, have, I think, 4 times the amount of vitamin C than an orange.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of stuff, as you said, coming fresh off the plant is actually significantly better than what we're picking up around a lot of the stores.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and obviously the lack of processed foods. Here in Arizona, I've learned that the Native American population are genetically more prone to diabetes for some reason. And diabetes is a huge issue it's an epidemic in the Native communities. Well, when you start researching a lot of these wild foods in the desert, but I would say in general, they're just so much better for you for blood sugar issues. Cactus, any type of cactus product, whether it's the pads or the fruit, really absolutely great for blood sugar, like the sugar absorption. You have your desert chia seeds here. You have even mesquite beans, which are the major staple food in the region. Just so many, and examples could go on at just how good they are for you. And I think right, we're at a time in history where we have more diabetes and everyone's dying from heart disease and cancer than ever before, right? I mean, didn't people not die from that type of stuff like in these crazy amounts that they do now? I mean, I think it's the amount of processed foods we're eating.
Oh, I definitely think there's a little link there too.
I mean, I have some theories on this stuff myself, just because I changed my diet a few years back. But one of the things they said is in the 80s, they told everyone fat was bad. And then they said they took fat out of most of the food, and what they did was put sugar back in it. So they take processed sugars, not natural sugars that are in your food naturally, and just add it to food to make it taste better. So, and generally, if you look at most people's diet now, high in pop, high in sugar, people who take coffee throw 2-3 tablespoons of sugar. If you take all that sugar, your body was never designed. It was never naturally ever able going to come across that much sugar through a natural food. It's only now when we can process it really quickly and easily, it's the cheapest form of energy we can give somebody. And It has almost no nutritional value past the energy. Where natural foods we're going to get, unprocessed foods, whole foods, even down to things like rices and stuff you eat. A whole rice with the whole shell and all that, which has all the fiber and the bran and stuff that your body needs to properly digest it anyways, would never give you the high that pure white, fully processed rice would do. Don't know that the food we eat is good because I think we've added too much stuff to it.
Yeah, I think the food pyramid having bread on the very bottom is almost opposite of what people today believe who are like going to keto and finding all the benefits of keto and fats and everything.
Funny enough, Ben, actually, that's his lifestyle change. He went pretty hard into keto. Well, not hard into keto. You are keto. You know what I mean? And there was direct
I've been
effects.
cheating now, and I feel the difference, and it's not good.
I'm definitely against keto. As a foraging instructor, it's bad for business.
Yeah.
But you know, surprisingly, it probably shouldn't be, because a lot of the stuff you forage isn't that high in sugar. Like, and I try to eat a lot of green vegetables because I think green vegetables are generally pretty good for you. It's this stuff that comes out of a box that, like, once I pulled that from my diet, made a huge difference. I mean, I kind of like meat.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, I have to eat bacon and eggs for breakfast every day.
Horrible.
It's terrible.
Absolutely disgusting.
Yeah. No, all jokes aside, ketos. I know a lot of people who are doing keto and even carnivore and just having amazing benefits. People losing weight like crazy, and yeah, it's great for you. Well, I'm not a nutritionist, but I would imagine it's pretty.
I'm not
cool.
a nutritionist
You mentioned
either,
desert chia seeds, and chia seeds is a huge part of my diet. It's a really high in fat, low in carb food that gives you a ton of energy, and it's also high in fiber, which helps with digestion and bowel movements and all that stuff. People don't want to talk about this stuff, right? People don't want to talk about your body really needs, because it's gross or disgusting. But the reality is, I think it's very important.
we're biological organisms that have to exist. I mean, if you want to break this down scientifically.
Yeah, I think I'm getting into the whole foraging instruction at a really perfect time in history, because more than ever, people are starting to really start to want to get back to the land and also to get healthier, and they're looking at wild foods as a way to sort of do both of those things. So it's a great time to be teaching about plants, I'd say.
I heard an interesting term a little while ago that I liked, called ingredient household, and it's for households that we make food using ingredients, not that we buy pre-made foods. And I think the understanding of what goes into your food and where it comes from, and the idea of foraging, like I think you must have noticed this. Foraged food tastes better.
Oh, by far.
Right?
The fresher something is, the better it tastes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, a carrot straight from your garden tastes better than the carrot from a store. And
Oh,
if
yeah.
you can find plants that have been growing naturally in the woods, they taste best of all. Like wild asparagus, if anybody's had the pleasure to eat that, tastes significantly better than homegrown asparagus. Like, don't get me wrong, it's both still asparagus, but it just tastes fresher, it's crisper, it's even a little sweeter, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, as a forager, I started realizing that every single fruit sold in stores is underripe.
Generally,
It's been ripened off. It's picked unripe and then ripens on the shelf. It's just not the same. I've had from South Florida, tree ripe mangoes, tree ripe star fruit. I've had obviously blackberries as a kid. I've never liked store bought blackberries because I've always eaten them from the wild as a kid. I've had blueberries from the wild, or just, you might get some good store bought blueberries every once in a while, but doesn't even compare. In strawberries, obviously wild strawberries are this big,
yeah.
but still, like a garden strawberry versus a store bought.
They're little flavor gems, right? Like when you eat one of those little wild strawberries, it's
all the flavor of a big strawberry packed into a little pimple.
Yeah, or you go to a farm where they're growing them, and you get the giant one that's actually all cracked inside, and you bite into it, it's like watery. It doesn't have the same texture feel. You work a lot harder for the wild strawberries, guaranteed, right?
Yeah.
But they're enjoyable.
Well, guys, my wife just passed me a little note that says we got to get going.
Get the hell off the podcast. These guys are taking up too much time. And that's cool. As we often do, we kind of went down some rabbit holes here at the end, and I think that's great. A lot of people are still listening here in the comments. We still got a good viewership there, but yeah, it's probably time for all of us to try and pack it in. My wife's waiting to go to bed, and I'm sure Ben wants to actually eat his supper. So
Yeah, I gotta go fix them up. My
oh yeah,
my
your
new ride.
motorcycle. You gotta do some work on that too. But from both of us here, Ben and I, thanks for coming back and having a chat with us, Matthew. I think it's been very informative. We talked about a lot of things, a lot of topics here. We covered way more than we ever intended to, but I think that's kind of the fun of this.
Yeah, I have tons of fun. I could talk about it all day. So thank you so much for having me.
No worries, and
Thank you for coming.
yeah, thank you once again for coming. Maybe in the future we'll touch bases again, and we'll have another little chat. We'll see what the people
Sure.
say. The people direct us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Stay in contact. We got our contact information now, and a
And we'll
chat
definitely
group.
be
We can.
chatting and we'll be staying in touch. I do got to hit you up for the list of books that we talked about here, that PDF you were talking about, because I know Chris Lovelace and I think Jacob were both looking for it from our comments here. So I'll make sure to attach that to the description of the YouTube, as well as the audio file that goes up on all the podcasting stuff there, as well as I will make links to all of Matthew's social media there, his Facebook, his YouTube, as well as his website, where if you want to find more information about him and what he does, you can check him out. And if you were just listening for the first time and you haven't already done so, definitely jump over and check out his stuff there so you can get a little bit more knowledge there and maybe take yourself a course. Because that's kind of what this is all about. We're doing some networking here. This gets hopefully some people over to Matthew and get to know what he does, and hopefully we can do the same here and they'll listen to us and be redirected back to him and the world goes around. So was there any final thoughts you wanted to put on here, Matthew, while you're still with us?
No, that's it. I just wanted to, thank everyone for listening, and I really enjoy talking about it. So I'm glad someone cares to hear about it.
Ben?
I'm good. Like we've always said, get out there, have fun, enjoy it.
All right, folks.
Try to learn.
Thanks once again for joining us. Y'all have yourself a good night. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks. Have a good